Sure, yeah, let me know if you have issues with that.
All right. And alrighty, there you go. So first, I want to thank the Waunakee Library for hosting me on behalf of the Agrace Grief Support Center tonight to provide a webinar on grief during COVID-19. And I want to thank all of you for attending and listening. Second, I do want to acknowledge that grief is a heavy topic by nature and it can be triggering. So if at any point during this presentation you need to put your head down or close your eyes, I promise that I will not be offended or be judgmental at all. I value self-care and it's very important that you take care of yourself. And third, if you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, feel free to unmute yourself and speak them into existence. Although I appreciate a polite hand raise, it's kind of difficult to catch everyone's hands during this virtual setting. So again, just feel free to unmute yourself. And lastly, before we get started, I would like to introduce myself. So I'm not just a stranger talking to you from across a screen. My name is Taran Lancaster, and I am a community grief support specialist at our Agrace Grief Support Center. Kind of like a tongue twister if you say it 4 times fast. I have been working for Agrace for just over 1 year now. Prior to employment, I volunteered at our support center for our family program throughout my undergraduate career. And I attended Edgewood College and obtained a bachelor's degree in child life. And so a lot of my experience is with children in medical settings. I am a certified child life specialist. And by the end of this year, I will have my master's degree in thanatology from Marian University. And thanatology is the scientific study of death and dying, which directly relates to tonight's presentation on grief during COVID-19. So now we will get started. So the goals for our time today. After our time here today, I hope you leave with an increase in your understanding of grief, an understanding of how COVID-19 is impacting grief, and ideas on how to best support grieving people. So first, what is grief? Is a natural response to any sort of loss that is seen as significant to the person. And the key phrase there is to the person. What may be significant to me may be insignificant to you. And that's okay because we are different people. Grief is not a problem that can be fixed or solved as much as society wished it were. Grief cannot be solved or cured with a magic pill. Again, grief, there's no timeline to grief. And grief is not a linear journey. You may feel acceptance one day and anger the next, and cycle through various emotions throughout a lifetime. It's just not linear. No 2 people grieve the same. Factors that grief can be impacted by include the relationship to the person and the quality of the relationship. I may grieve the death of a grandparent differently than someone else would because our relationships to our grandparents are different. And same with a relationship to a friend or a spouse or a sibling. We just are different people with different relationships that are formed. Further factors that can impact grief include the circumstances of the death. Was the death sudden or expected? Was there closure and the ability to say goodbye to that person if you wanted to? Was the death caused by murder or suicide or an overdose? Again, those circumstances can really impact the trajectory of grief. Grief can also be influenced by the coping skills the person has. If a person has a strong foundation of coping mechanisms prior to the death, they may carry some of those coping skills into their grief journey. And if they do not have a basis of coping, it may look different. Lastly, access to resources can really impact grief. We see this a lot with rural areas. A grief support center may be hours away from their home, and transportation may just not be feasible at that time. And in today's virtual world, Wi-Fi. Some people do not have access to Wi-Fi in their homes, and that can be a barrier to grief resources. So while we are talking about grief reactions, I want to show a model of grief that resonates with a lot of people. It's called the dual process of grief. So within everyday life, you may oscillate between loss-oriented and restoration-oriented. Loss-oriented includes grief work, intrusion of grief, breaking bonds, ties, and relocation. Denial, avoidance of restoration changes. Really focused on that grief work. But you also may oscillate to restoration-oriented, which is attending to life changes, doing new things, distracting yourself from the grief, maybe spending time with loved ones or friends. Denial and avoidance of grief, and forming new roles, identities, and relationships. And a visual that I think sums up grief really well is right here, how we want grief to work. We want it to be a straight line. We want a medal at the end of the finish line that says, congratulations, you've made it through grief. Your journey through grief is complete. But that's not how it works. Grief is much more messy, and grief has a lot of ups and downs and progress and declines. It looks like a big scribble mark, like you can see on the screen, and that's normal. And grief is definitely much more than sadness. So I will ask a question to leave it up for discussion. What other emotions might be part of the grief response?
Denial, anger.
Definitely. All right, I'll cover some other ones that we commonly see at the support center. Fear, guilt, numbness, confusion, jealousy, relief, loneliness, foggy, anxious, filled with what ifs, exhausted, lost, distracted, despair, helpless, weak, and one that we kind of hear our clients whisper sometimes is that they feel grateful, but that's okay. That's a normal response to grief. They may feel grateful that their loved one is no longer in pain. They may feel grateful to finally have weight lifted off of their shoulders. And that's just part of the grief response. Grief reactions are as varied as the people who experience them. All of these reactions are normal. That may include wanting to isolate yourself, silent weeping, vocal wailing, being with others, feeling frazzled and overwhelmed, finding joy and connection. And kids grieve in their own ways as well. With kids, they tend to express their grief a lot through play. They may experience less of the crying out and discussions that adults may have. Their grief may be projected onto their Barbie dolls or their figurines. They may express grief through imaginative play. And next, I will cover anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is grief that occurs as we anticipate a loss, or as we first understand that death is a possible outcome. We may grieve losses of independence, mobility, plans, dreams, etc. Anticipatory grief encompasses many of the same emotions as grief after a death. And it's really important to keep in mind that just because a death was anticipated, it doesn't mean that post-death grief will be better or worse. Again, there are many factors that we discussed prior that can impact grief. And next, we will be moving on to complicated grief and how COVID-19 is impacting grief. So I want to start with a definition of complicated grief, and then we will move on to how complicated grief is being impacted and how it's correlated to COVID-19. So complicated grief is a persistent form of intense grief in which maladaptive thoughts and dysfunctional behaviors are present, along with continued longing and sadness, and or preoccupation with thoughts and memories of the person who died. Grief continues to dominate life, and the future seems bleak and empty. Irrational thoughts that the deceased person might reappear are common, and the bereaved person feels lost and alone. And that definition is from the Columbia Center for Complicated Grief. A statistic is that 20 to 30% of people are at risk of developing complicated grief, and about 15% of those individuals will exhibit complicated grief. Again, that goes back to those factors. Do they have a support system? Do they have strong coping mechanisms and coping tools in place? So what can complicated grief look like in relation to COVID-19? Experts don't know or don't have a lot of research yet to draw from. As we know, peer-reviewed articles and peer-reviewed studies take time. And even though it seems like we have been living within the COVID-19 world forever, it has been a year, and in research time, that's just not that long. But here is what some of the grief experts are expecting to see as it relates to grief responses being heightened due to COVID-19. Trauma being separated from a loved one at end of life. A heightened sense of threat, hyper-alertness, panic when the phone rings, or obsessing over data related to COVID-19. As we have all seen, that data is everywhere. It's on TV, it's on our computers, it's everywhere we go, it's on our screens. Increased stress and anxiety. Hypervigilance regarding hand washing, social distancing, wearing a mask, trying to protect what you love and care about. Feeling that they or their loved ones are being stigmatized. Well, how did your loved one get COVID-19? Were they being reckless? Did they contract COVID-19 while hugging someone when they shouldn't have been? Again, there's a lot of stigma behind it that may be faced. Rumination and questioning. Did my loved one suffer? Were they alone? Will others get it and die too? Did we mess up? And with that, hindsight bias. I should have known not to go to that store. I should have known not to go on that vacation. I shouldn't have let them go to that birthday party. Loss and frustration due to changes in or lack of rituals. And those may include funerals or memorials or end-of-life celebrations. Social and emotional isolation. Guilt and regret. Anger. Displacement of anger and frustration onto others, especially onto funeral professionals. Increased negative coping. We have seen this with increased use in substances, avoidance, and withdrawal. Inflexibility. If I can't have the funeral that I would like for my loved one, then I just won't have it at all. Feeling cheated out of an opportunity to say goodbye. So what is it about COVID-19 that contributes to complicated grief? During the pandemic, of course, we have COVID and non-COVID related deaths, and both can cause complicated grief. I think that we can all understand, even if someone didn't die of COVID-19, their family's grief will be impacted by COVID-19. Complicated grief likely could be the next pandemic, as it is very likely in this situation. Deaths are often sudden and unexpected with COVID-19. Loved ones are not able to physically be with a dying person due to COVID-19 restrictions and safety protocols. They may not be able to be in a hospital room or at their bedside. Or they may not be able to travel and get on a plane to say goodbye to a loved one either. Again, there are just so many restrictions to physically being with someone. The nature of the disease. This can also attribute to survivor's guilt, which is exactly what it sounds like. If two people in a family contracted COVID-19 and only one of them died, that may lead to the surviving person feeling very guilty and wondering why they survived and their loved one did not. And again, that potential stigma related. And that can be seen, was it my fault because I allowed the neighbors to come over for the bonfire? Was it my fault that they got COVID-19 because I sent them to the store? A lot of self-blame associated with that stigma. And loss of rituals. We have seen funerals and end-of-life services have to adapt and take form in a different way. Some of these services are being provided online. Other places are able to offer drive-through funeral services. Either way, it's still different and it's not like we would have expected. And that may attribute to complicated or cause complicated grief. Now we are going to transition to the section on what to say, what to avoid saying, and what you can do that will be most helpful and supporting to grieving people. So how can you help others? What is in your control to help yourself and others who are grieving? Well, you can help by increasing your understanding of grief, which is exactly what you are all doing tonight by listening to this presentation and engaging in discussion. You can understand that there is often a wave of grief that happens months after a death. So if a friend approaches you and says, I don't know what's wrong with me, but I'm just really struggling with Frank's death right now, you can talk with them and about how normal this is. Our society is very death denying while also being very death obsessed. When death occurs that's tragic or unexpected or devastating, we broadcast it on the news. We share it everywhere. But when it comes to actually discussing this grief, we hide it. We shove it under a rug. Society is rather uncomfortable navigating and discussing grief. I mean, what does 3 or 5 days of bereavement leave tell an employee? That they should be over a death by then, that their grieving journey should be over. And when they don't feel over it, that leads them to feel that they are grieving incorrectly or that there is something wrong with them. So really pushing back against what society has taught us about grief may be really beneficial for the loved ones in your life. And going on to societal expectations in the casserole committee. This is a committee that's very well-meaning, but what message does it send to a family who is grieving if the food stops 2 weeks after a death, that they should have their acts together by then? We oftentimes hear that friends and family stop coming by or stop asking about grief a few months after a death, when really they need that support continuously. And grief takes more energy than people realize. Grief impacts every single aspect of life, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, financially, physically, and socially. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to navigate all of those aspects. So what can you say? We all want to help. We all want to say or do something to support our friends. So what is most helpful? We'll share some actual statements on the next slide. But before we get there, you don't have to speak to communicate. You can refer to body language, facial expressions, breathing patterns, and just being present, being self-aware. You can also track with them, match their facial expressions and their body posture as well. And there are cultural considerations. You can ask them what their culture is or what their religion is so that you can be more aware while you are comforting them. So here are some actual statements that you can use. I'm not sure what would be most helpful, but I care and I am here. Do you remember the time the four of us? Oftentimes memories may bring a smile to a loved one or to someone's face. Frank was such a good cook. I'm going to miss his food at our get-togethers. Just saying the deceased one's name is really beneficial so that you can let them know that their legacy lives on. I'm going to invite you to book club and you can say no, but I'm going to continue to invite you in case one day you change your mind. Again, that constant invitation, always being there and acknowledging that they may not be ready, but when they are ready, that invitation still stands. I'm going for a walk in an hour. Would you like to join me? Again, giving them a choice, and exercise and being out in nature can be really beneficial. There's no time limit to my support. I'm willing to listen anytime, weeks, months, years from now. How can I best support you? Or what do I need to know about your beliefs to best support you? Thinking of you today, we're honoring Mike by eating at his favorite restaurant. Oftentimes, birthdays can be really important for someone who has lost a loved one, and acknowledging those special days can be really helpful in their grief journey, that you have not forgotten them. And now that we have covered what you can say, what can you do, especially during the time of COVID-19? You can send something in the mail or drop something off at their doorstep. Groceries, a care package, flowers, a card, etc. Maybe you can make them their favorite recipe and continue to check in so that you're not like the casserole committee, but that still might be a helpful treat to have now and then. Offer specific practical help. Oftentimes there may be paperwork that's involved, and just helping with the practical task may be really beneficial. Or with the snow right now, maybe shoveling out their drive so that they can spend their energy on other aspects of their life may be helpful as well. And be willing to hear their pain without trying to change it. If you try to talk them out of their pain, they will simply stop talking to you about their pain. And we want everyone to feel comfortable confiding in one another. And not forgetting. Write down those important dates, such as birthdays or anniversaries or death dates, and acknowledge them when they roll around, and not just within the first year. And now we will discuss what not to say. And this photo on our screen, we actually took these examples from some of our kids in our family program of things that they have been told by friends, loved ones, or teachers that did not necessarily sit well with them and that they did not appreciate. But before I read these, I do want to acknowledge that every single person is different. And even if a phrase is on this list of what not to say, it may be helpful for someone else. So again, just really making sure that you know to ask someone how you can best support them and get to know their beliefs. That really would be the most helpful. So it's important to avoid saying anything with religious overtones unless you know that person and their beliefs very well and you know that that's something that they would appreciate. Anything that implies being dead is better than being alive. Comparing your own or others' experiences of loss. Any statement that begins with the words at least is a silver lining phrase. It's not empathetic to say, well, at least this, or at least you got to be with them for this many years, or at least you got to say goodbye. It really discredits their feelings and compares it to something else, and it's just not empathetic to say at least. Any don't feelings, such as don't cry or don't get angry. Well, if it was that easy, we would, and to say don't cry, that just puts down the human experience and human emotions that are so important and can be helpful in the grief journey. And moving on to the examples from our kids, you'll have a new life. Your mom had a good or long life. You're not the only one who has lost someone. They would have wanted you to live and be happy. I'm sorry for your loss. This is one that some people do appreciate, but oftentimes we put it on our what not to say list because our clients tell us that it gets very repetitive and the person that says it isn't responsible for the person's death. And so when you've heard "I'm sorry for your loss" over and over, some of our kids say, well, what did you do? You didn't kill my mom, or you didn't kill my sibling. There are just better alternatives to say. Time heals all wounds. They're in a better place now. Well, isn't the better place here with me? The person who caused their death is going to suffer. You really need to make peace with it. God called them, or everything happens for a reason. And now I'm going to try to play a video about our Agrace Grief Support Center, if it will come in. Can you hear this video?
Yep.
Thank you.
It's kind of going in and out, Taran. I don't know if. Like, I can't hear anything right now. I don't know if anyone else can.
No, I can't either.
Oh, but you could at the beginning?
It was it was a little in and out at the beginning, but there was at least some words coming through.
Well, maybe I will just email you the link to the video.
Okay.
And that way, because I'm not sure how else to
Sure.
troubleshoot that one, unfortunately, but we can certainly email it and I can do a verbal explanation right now. So I can play it and speak with it if that helps. I'm not sure if that would cause too much of a headache though. Essentially, our Grief Support Center, we have many playrooms, and within our playrooms is our hospital playroom or medical playroom where kids can recreate the scenes that they have experienced while caring for a loved one. It really helps clear up any misconceptions about a death that they have experienced. We also have our dramatic playroom, which is filled with a little stage, dress-up costumes, props that they can use to put on a play or performance. We have a quiet room, which we have a sand table in, and within our sand table, we have miniature urns or caskets so that they can recreate the burial scene if that's something that would be therapeutic for them as they navigate and talk through their grief. We also have plenty of children's books on death if they would like to just sit in one of our comfy chairs in our quiet room and read. And then we have board games in there as well. We also have a big tornado room or a big energy room. And so for a lot of times, kids really like to get that physical energy out, and grief can manifest itself physically. And they will punch a punching bag, or they will throw baskets or shoot hoops in the basketball room, or they will hula hoop. We have lots of fun options in there. And then I see we have a question if we have art therapy at Agrace. So we do have an art room. We currently do not have a certified art therapist on our team, but we do lead art projects and grief-related art activities in our art room. And one of our current offerings is that we are able to send home these art activities to anyone in the community for free. We can mail them out. We have a mask making activity that they can do. So they may decorate a mask that represents how they feel about the death of a loved one. We have a pillowcase activity. So on one side, they decorate the pillowcase with positive thoughts or good memories with the person that died. And then on the other side, they decorate the pillowcase with negative emotions related to the death of a loved one or negative experiences, or maybe some of those things that friends told them about the death of their loved one that did not sit well with them. And the purpose of the pillowcase activity is that when they're feeling frustrated or sad, that they can punch or scream into that negative side. And then when they're done, they can flip it over to the positive side as their body is more regulated and calm. So we do have plenty of art activities that we can send home right now. If you know anyone in the community, or if you yourself know anyone that would benefit from those. We also have a teen lounge, and that is one of my favorite rooms. We have instruments in there, we have air hockey. It's just a very cool, laid back zone for our adolescents to utilize and kind of mingle amongst themselves. And then we have, of course, our conference rooms and our adult meeting rooms. And we have a really nice, which is up right now, a dining room table set up where we have many tables within the kitchen. And before each family program, we all sit down with each other, volunteers, staff, families, and we all share a meal together. We find that this is an excellent time to build rapport with one another. That's pretty much our center right now. We are currently offering virtual services. We offer virtual one-on-ones up to 4 sessions for both kids and adults. And then we also are running grief support groups. We have our family programs still running, so any kids are welcome to join those. And we have our Bridges drop-in support group, and we often have a couple of other adult support groups as well. But otherwise,
Parents or caregivers.
Otherwise, we will just have time for questions, comments, anything that anyone would like to share tonight.
Can you hear me okay?
Oh, where is Agrace? I see this in the chat, but I could not hear you speaking just then. Where is Agrace? So our Agrace Grief Support Center is in Fitchburg, and then our Agrace Hospice Care is in Fitchburg as well, but they are different facilities. Our Grief Support Center is a standalone facility. We used to offer grief support services out of our main Agrace area, but we just found it more therapeutic and beneficial for it to be a standalone facility, so that there were only memories associated with that one building in particular. And that allowed us to expand all of our fun playrooms as well.
Do people have to like make an appointment to come to the grief center, or they can, or is it like walk-ins? Or I'm sure with COVID it's not walk-in, but how's the process of like getting there and hanging out?
Yeah, so for our Bridges drop-in group in a non-COVID world, you do not need to make an appointment or make anyone aware that you will be attending. You can just come on those nights that Bridges is offered. We also have a morning group as well, typically for that. But for our family program or one-on-ones, you do need to make an appointment, and then you can utilize those services such as the little library nook that we have. But in non-COVID times, we typically have someone working at the front desk, so you could drop in and make an appointment that way as well. But we do have email and we have our phone too, so different avenues that you can make an appointment through.
Cool, thanks.
Courtney, can you hear me okay?
I can, yep.
Okay, so if anybody is interested in more information on the Grief Center, we can get your name, we can email the brochures, we could email, or we could send brochures in the mail to the people who are listening. And also, Courtney, I can bring a stack of those brochures out to your library also, if that would be helpful, because like Taran is sharing, there's different groups, different one-on-ones, and it's hard to cover it all and explain it clearly sometimes. It's a wealth. It's a beautiful facility, and it's a wealth of help there for young and old.
Sure.
So I'm happy to get those brochures out to you and anybody listening tonight too.
Yeah, the library will definitely take some brochures to put out. And I guess, is it okay to say if you're interested in a brochure to maybe like message Carrie privately, like right now in the chat or something, and let her know if you're interested in more information, but the library will definitely take some brochures. So if you come to the library, be on the lookout for that.
Perfect.
Great idea. Thank you, Carrie.
Well, and I was thinking about, as we've done a few in-services on this, and every time I hear it, I think about the time when my mother died, and I had been working with Agrace for years, and I just remember thinking, yes, this is going to be tough, but I'll get through it because I work for the company that, helps with the end of life. And anyway, long story short, I ended up taking a month leave of absence.
Mhm.
She died several years ago, but she was my best friend and the woman I knew longest my whole life. And I was devastated, just devastated. So I always appreciate when you talk, Taran, about grief kind of has its own energy. It's got its own, we all take our own journeys with it. And it does come and go. So this in-service is always very validating for me.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
Such an important topic. Yeah, thank you both. Thank you, Taran. Thank you, Carrie, for helping put this on tonight. I guess if there are no more questions,
Oh, I see one in the chat.
sure.
Does
it looks like,
Agrace's services charge insurance, or does client pay out of pocket? Okay, so we do have a fee for our services, but the last thing Agrace wants is to turn anyone away because of a fee. So we will waive that fee anytime. It's never a barrier. That we never want grief support and finances, or grief support and fees associated in the same sentence if it's just not feasible for someone to be able to pay. So yes and no. It's encouraged to pay, but also it's no way going to stop anyone from entering our doors or calling our phones.
all right, any other questions? I know somebody just joined us, so this presentation has been recorded, so we will post it on the library's YouTube channel if Agrace is okay with that. And so that will be there for people to refer back to. So no worries if you came late. But thank you again, Carrie. Thank you, Taran. This was awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
hosting.
All right, I'm gonna stop the recording, and I guess we are